First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody here this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to see so many of you in the room for this event, which we're very excited about. My name, for those of you that don't know, is Nicholas Wheeler. I'm recently appointed here to the University at Birmingham. I'm a Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science and International Studies. And I'm also the Director of the newly established Institute for Conflict, Cooperation and Security at the University of Birmingham. This afternoon's workshop is the first public event of the new institute. So it's very exciting for us all. The Institute aims to bring together researchers from across departments and schools at Birmingham, specialising in all aspects of security. We're particularly interested in exploring multidisciplinary approaches to security and understanding security as a multidimensional concept. And we're looking to develop in the months and years ahead research across a whole variety of different areas. And at the moment we're in the process of putting together a website. And newly appointed research assistant David Norman is taking the lead in developing the website, and David's at the back there with Sam, organising the vidcasting of the event this afternoon. I'm particularly delighted that we brought together for this afternoon's event researchers from across the colleges, social sciences and arts and law. It's a great privilege for me, again, to share the platform many, many years later. I won't tell you the last time Scott and I sat alongside each other, but it's we're talking decades and not years. But I'm delighted that we've got people together this afternoon from across the colleges, because that's very much what the new institute has as one of its key goals, is to bring people from across the whole of the university together to try and enable Birmingham to develop an even stronger profile in the security field than it already has, and to project it into the ranks of the tops across not only the United Kingdom but internationally as well. I'm also very pleased to welcome to Birmingham two external speakers this afternoon, Sir Richard Bolton, who you'll hear from later this afternoon, who we're delighted to have here, and Dr. Naomi Head from the University of Glasgow, who you'll also hear from later, who is an honorary research fellow of the Institute, specialising in communication and conflict transformation. In terms of the discussions this afternoon, what we're planning to do is to the presentations will be vidcast on the new website. But the Q&A, we would ask that the Q&A be held under the Chatham House rule. So we won't be recording any of the Q&A. For those of you who don't know the Chatham House rule, I'm sure you all do, but this means that anything that's said in the room, you can use that information in your work, but you're not allowed to attribute it to any particular individual that has said it. So we will conduct the Q&A under the Chatham House rule. And I'd also ask that when you speak, if you could perhaps say who you are and your affiliation, so we know that. So let me then, without having done the housekeeping bits and said a word or two about the Institute, let us get underway with the first session. And let me just say a word briefly about our three speakers on the first panel. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, and then hopefully that will allow us 20 minutes for questions, and then there'll be some coffee, have a break, and then we'll return for the second and third sessions. Okay, so first of all, I'm delighted on my left to introduce Stefan Wolff, who doesn't need any introduction, I think, in this room. Professor of International Security, of course, in the Department of Political Science and International Studies here. A political scientist by background, Stefan specialises in the management of contemporary international security challenges. He's the author of several books and numerous articles on the prevention, management and settlement of ethnic conflicts and post-stabilization, and he'll speak on international security and the Iranian threat. Stefan.
Thank you very much, Nick. Nick, you know it's 7 minutes past. There's an argument later that I feel threatened, not at an international level, but rather locally, in terms of what I can deliver here. So, international security and the Iranian threat. What I want to do is very briefly outline, first of all, what I think the threat is, what the threats are, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more in a minute. And then also say something about how we can actually assess this threat. And here I'll focus on 3 dimensions. First of all, how credible the threat is, what the potential impact would be of the threat being carried out, and how vulnerable various people, countries, states exposed to the threat would actually be to that happening. So, what is the threat? I think the important point here for me is to distinguish actually between 2 threats that Iran poses in relation to its nuclear program. One, and probably the more immediate one, is Iran actually acquiring nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons capability, and the other one is the use of these weapons. And I really think it's important to make a distinction between, on the one hand, becoming a nuclear weapon state, and on the other, then actually using these nuclear weapons. Now, how credible is either of these threats? I think first of all, we don't really know. That sort of all the research that I have done on that, and the news and assessments that I have followed, it's all a guess. And it partly is a guess because Iran has not exactly a very good track record of fully cooperating with the IAEA. And it has made a wide range of public pronouncements that range from, under no circumstances will we ever endeavor to acquire nuclear weapons. Our program is completely for peaceful purposes only, to, well, let's put it, more ambiguous statements about what is actually behind Iran's activities. You also have to put that a little bit into the context of where the facilities actually are, how secret they are, when they were revealed, how easy it would be to actually get to them if there was sort of a military component to the Iranian nuclear program or not. So I think it's, I don't want to talk too much about this because it's really Nick's expertise, but there's a big issue of trust here. I think to some extent, the lack of trust, to some extent I think one might argue clouds a little bit our assessment of the threat in the sense of Iran actually acquiring nuclear weapons, becoming a nuclear weapons state. Now, related to this is, I mean, credibility of the threat, if we assume Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, is also, well, once they have them, what do they do with them? The first question then to ask from a military perspective is, well, what delivery capabilities do they have? And I mean, there is a history of reasonably successful tests of missiles in Iran, at least mid-range missiles that, so if you do the geographical maths, I mean, that could get, at least in terms of their range, all the way to Israel and to other sort of countries around the region that might potentially feel threatened. And then the other one that occasionally is being pushed in a slightly different context is, of course, Iran's links with, or alleged links with terrorist groups, and therefore what I would call vertical proliferation, so Iran potentially enabling other actors to deliver a dirty bomb. Now that, in a sense, then already sort of touches upon the second part of the threat, of the second threat dimension, namely the actual use, not just Iran having one, but Iran potentially using nuclear weapons. And here, I would say that's it's a much different matter, and even if we only assume a minimum degree of rationality on part of the Iranian leadership, I really cannot foresee a scenario at the moment where Iran would deploy nuclear weapons first use on an actual battlefield. So I think that's, in my assessment, really out of the question, certainly in the foreseeable future. However, there is an issue here, of course, with retaliatory use, both in the sense that if there was a major military conflict, even though it might be linked to Iran's nuclear program, I think there would be sort of a context in which one could see that when Iran finds itself back against the wall, as it were, that it would then, sort of in a last-ditch effort, possibly deploy nuclear weapons or make use of the dirty bomb scenario. Now, again, on this basis, let me emphasize that I don't necessarily see that second scenario, the use of nuclear weapons, really as a, from this perspective, very credible threat at the moment. But let's assume that it did happen, either one of these two. What would the impact actually be? So it's not about just the credibility of the threat, but also what impact would we have to expect here. In terms of Iran becoming a nuclear-armed state, I think that would mean a very clear and decisive shift in the regional balance of power. It would at least potentially be a direct military threat, primarily here, I would say, to Israel and Saudi Arabia as sort of the other key players in the region. On the basis of having nuclear weapons, a more likely, politically much more assertive Iran could become a much more influential player in the region that the West, and including the United States, of course, consider an area of vital interest. If you just look at it geographically, I mean, you're talking Afghanistan, Iraq, the Persian Gulf, Caspian Sea, Pakistan, Syria, Israeli Palestinian territories. I mean, all of these are, from an international security perspective, very, very volatile and very, very sensitive areas. And certainly from a Western perspective, also personally speaking here, I don't need Iran necessarily to become more assertive, certainly against the background of the knowledge that I have of Iranian intentions, strategies. But also what it would mean is if Iran had nuclear weapons, it would limit, I think, the options available to respond to Iranian policies that might threaten Western interests in the region. So it would be really a different game, a different level of the game that would be played. The impact of Iran deploying nuclear weapons in an actual confrontation, and that would be devastating. I mean, all we know of sort of the way in which nuclear weapons work, it would be horrendous for the country or for the area, which would be at the receiving end of such a deployment. It would, of course, be devastating to Iran itself because of the likely retaliation that it could face. Stability in the region would be completely off, I think, and also international security, of course, a range of different dimensions from ecological and energy security all the way through to economic and military security. I think it would be a major game changer more than anything I think that we have had basically since the first use of nuclear weapons at the end of the Second World War. And that would be a really novel and very serious issue happening here, but let me remind you of what I said earlier. That's not the most likely scenario that I actually see occurring. Now, final point, how vulnerable are we actually to any of these threats really being carried out? So how vulnerable are we to Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state? How vulnerable are we to these weapons actually being deployed? Now, vulnerability, in my sort of understanding of the term, we have to measure both in relation to defensive capabilities that we have and resilience. Resilience here meaning, well, how could we cope if our defenses failed and it would actually happen. Now, I think the way in which you can think about this is probably best in terms of concentric circles, where the greatest vulnerability is at the center. And then the farther you get away from the center, the less acute vulnerability would be. So greatest vulnerability at the center and lowest resilience at the center of these concentric circles. And I think that works reasonably well for both threats. So both the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Iran and their deployment. We have highest vulnerability, lowest resilience at the center. And it also, I think, works reasonably well if we look at this in terms of the defensive capabilities. So, two conclusions that I would draw from that, and I'm just about coming up to my 10-minute limit. First of all, I think from a Western perspective, the threat is real. It may have been talked up, hyped up at times, but I do think the threat is real in both dimensions, more so, of course, in terms of the acquisition. But mostly what it affects, from a Western perspective, is our interests and allies in the region more than directly ourselves. I don't think that an Iranian nuclear warhead or a dirty bomb are very likely to ever reach Washington, London, Brussels, Berlin, any of the other Western capitals or the countries for which they stand. And then the other point, of course, is that from an Iranian perspective, acquiring nuclear weapons capabilities, let alone deploying them, also poses a very, very grave risk to the country and its leadership, simply because in what other countries on the outside would actually do in response to these threats. I mean, it really cuts both ways. I mean, it's not just that Iran suddenly becomes unvulnerable, unattackable, because it has nuclear weapons. I think it's one of the key countries that are actually threatened by this development. I think in many ways it's Iran itself. And bearing these two things in mind, the relatively limited vulnerability that we have in the West, and the very grave risks that the acquisition of nuclear weapons capability actually poses to Iran itself. I mean, these are two very important things that we need to factor into any discussion of what responses the West, the international community, other players in the region should actually have to this developing story of Iran's nuclear program. And on that note, I close 2 minutes over time. I apologize.
That's okay. Thank you. Okay, our second speaker is Scott Lucas, who has been on the staff here at Birmingham since '89 and has been Professor of American Studies since 1997. Scott began his career as a specialist in US and British foreign policy, but his research interests range much wider now, covering North Africa, the Middle East, and of course Iran, which he writes regularly about on his blog, and is an active commentator in the blogosphere. And of course he's written widely in books and articles on all these subjects. So it's a great pleasure to have Scott here. And can you keep us 10 minutes, please?
Right. First of all, I apologize to my father and to you, because 10 minutes doesn't mean I can tell the joke about the preacher, the drunk, and the streetlight. Good joke, and I'll tell it later, but not here. Second apology is I'm going to big up why I'm here, and that is what started off as a blog is now a news site called EA Worldview. And effectively, this site, we would hope, is now one of the leading sites for day-to-day coverage of Iran. Daily rolling coverage since June 13, 2009. Not necessarily a significant date on the nuclear front, but definitely on the political front, because it was the day after the presidential election. And then analyses each day, not only of the nuclear issue, but in fact, probably more importantly, and you'll see this in the talk, analyses of the political, economic, and social dynamics within the country and in Iran's place within the region. 3 arguments. Argument 1, drawing from the esteemed international relations theorist Wallace and Gromit, the wrong trousers. Why is it the wrong trousers? Because despite the bluster and despite the overreaction, there will be no Iranian attack, such as the closure of the Straits of Hormuz. There will be no terrorist attack on Western interests, such as the New York City police have been arguing, because indeed Iran is not even close at this moment to nuclear capability for the use of weapons. Iran, I would argue, there is no evidence that Iran is even pursuing a military program at this point. Indeed, if you look at the latest IEA report, which was spun as proving this, in fact, there is no new evidence in the IEA report after 2003, which is when Iran claims that it suspended research and development on possible military use. There is conjecture and speculation, but at the end of the day, the IEA's argument is not that they have evidence that there's a military program, but that they do not have full access to the range of Iranian programs to get disclosure, which is the same thing they have said in every report since 2009. Even if they were close to providing, as it were, a breakout capability for the potential use of nuclear weapons, as Stefan referred to, there is no evidence, in fact, that this is part of Iranian strategy, as part of regional strategy. Not a single item can be put to you. The only piece of evidence that says they're even close to pursuing nukes was when a right-wing blogger dared speculated, and the Revolutionary Guards, a little bit inexperienced in social media, put up the blog entry on their website, cleared out, and then quickly withdrew it when people in the West said this proves, in fact, that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons. The sites at Natanz and Fordow are not even fully operational. Even if they were operational, they cannot provide enough uranium to supply Iran's domestic programs, let alone supply a military program on top of that. A country which is having problems with its Bushehr reactor, its first nuclear reactor, which is not operational after more than 18 months when it was supposedly launched, is not one which is a nuclear weapons superpower. The threat of an Israeli attack is greatly exaggerated, and I know I'm calling on the tightrope right here because Asaf's coming right behind me. But from my reading of this, Iran's motivations in declaring that it might attack Iran are more motivated by political calculations than they are a military calculation regarding the necessity for a preemptive strike. In particular, and tying into a bigger point I'll make in a moment, the more that Israel can focus on Iran as a threat, the less that it has to deal with immediate issues, immediate challenging political issues, such as the negotiations with the Palestinians about a resolution, and such as the negotiations with a series of Arab states about the changing events in the region. Iran is a specter. It is a ghost. It is a bogeyman. Some neoconservatives in the United States, some politicians, some in Israel might desire a strike against Iran, but this is not the same as saying that the Israeli establishment is preparing for one. And indeed, if you ask yourself today, why is it that a senior commander in the Israeli military suddenly said, as quoted by Haaretz, we do not see Iran moving to a militarized nuclear capability, what changed? The intelligence or the political calculation? Why do we continue to pursue these, chase our tails? Because this is the trap of the nuclear first approach. It misses the diversionary aspects of portraying the nuclear specter. The diversionary aspects, sometimes for American politicians, sometimes for Israeli, sometimes for the Iranians, and it misses the leverage aspects that you posture and you pose about the nuclear program, not first and foremost because there is a nuclear conflict which is imminent, but because you're playing other political games regarding your position in the region and internationally, and even with your domestic audience. And the trap of the nuclear first approach, whether it is put forth by reporters like David Sanger and William Broad at the New York Times, Joby Warwick at the Washington Post, the Jerusalem Post, the Islamic Republic News Agency, the trap of the nuclear first approach is that it misses context. It misses the wider dynamics that are going on in which the nuclear issue is a pawn, not the king, which leads to the resolution of the chess match. Area 2, with that in mind, Iranian politics, perspectives, and postures. Why are nuclear weapons, why is the nuclear issue a diversionary issue for the Iranians? Because they can use it to play games and to pose, for example, in the region, in terms of regional context. One could argue, for example, that their position in the Middle East and North Africa, ranging from Egypt to the Lebanon, to Syria, to Afghanistan, has been the foremost concern for Iranian foreign policy for many, many years. One can argue since 2011, starting 2011, with that interest in mind, that Iran faces a much different situation with the changes in the political environment in many of the countries in North Africa and the Middle East. Yet Iran has to put forth the message that this, in fact, is an Islamic awakening. That this, in fact, are peoples within the Middle East and North Africa who are not rising for local concerns, not rising certainly against Iranian interests. They are rising to follow the example set by the Islamic Republic in 1979. If Iran can show defiance against the West, if they can challenge the Americans, the Zionist state, the West, to portray themselves as the victim who turns into the victor, then they feel they get leverage with all these issues. And that is how they use the nuclear issue and have used it consistently. What do we miss with this nuclear first approach in terms of it being a diversion? We miss the domestic context. Far from being unified on the nuclear issue, not only on the basic issue of whether or not to pursue a nuclear weapon, whether this is religiously legitimate, but even in terms of tactics and strategy versus the West, the Iranian regime is not unified, it is very, very divided. Example, the closest before the current set of talks that we saw in terms of a prospect of a resolution and deal was in October 2009 with the Geneva and Vienna talks. At that time, the person within the Iranian establishment who most favored a deal for the sake of his legitimacy, since his legitimacy was in question because of the disputed presidential election, was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The person who undercut the talks was Speaker of Parliament Ali Larijani, when he suddenly declared, in fact, that Iran would give up sovereignty and would not give any way on a uranium enrichment deal. Whether or not Larijani was speaking on behalf of the Supreme Leader is still a question which needs to be resolved. I personally think he did. But consider the domestic context and consider this. The actor right now who is most open to talks with the West, not necessarily a deal, but talks, is the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who we have been told for years is intransigent, would not countenance the prospect of a deal. Why is he looking for a deal at this point? That in a moment. But realize that because he is seeking a deal, the Speaker of Parliament, Ali Larijani, is now supporting the negotiations. The person who is now opposing the negotiations and doing so through allies, through websites, through his own media, such as Iran newspaper, is President Ahmadinejad, who is trying to undercut the discussions. If you don't appreciate the domestic context, this incredibly complex domestic context, you will never get beyond the nuclear first track. The consequences, to put it bluntly, Iran is dealing for weakness, but it is posing with strength. Why do I argue it's dealing for weakness? Iran is in the weakest position that it faces in the region for many, many years. Despite the posture, and you will see this continually, that they have the strength, they are in an uncertain position regarding Afghanistan. So is the United States, for that matter. But the fact is, it's not necessarily that Iran wins when the U.S. loses. They are in an uncertain position in Iraq. Despite, for example, the visit this week of Prime Minister Maliki to Iran, the fact is that we're not talking about Iran control or dominance over Iraq when you consider, for example, that in Iran is in its weakest position in years vis-a-vis arguably the emerging regional influence, which is Turkey. Iran is in a very shaky position regarding its relationship with Syria. It has not benefited as it thought it would from the uprising against the Mubarak regime in Egypt because the Muslim Brotherhood is not towing a Tehran first line, which anyone probably could have told you, but which Iranian specialists, who can be quite narrow in their perspective, misguidedly thought would happen in February 2011. It is dealing for weakness in terms of political fragmentation, as I've mentioned, and it is dealing for political weakness in particular because of the economic situation. The combination of sanctions with an already existing dysfunctional economic system within Iran, dysfunctional in terms of production, imports, currency, subsidies, basic social provision, means that the Iranian system is in the shakiest economic position it has ever been in since the 1980s in the war with Iraq. Inflation, which officially is listed at 21%, but unofficially is probably double that amount. Unemployment, which is soaring, arguably more than 30% and more than 60% in certain regions such as Baluchistan and the southeast. A currency which has fallen 50% in value since September 2011. I could go on, but I'm watching the guy to my left. Yeah. Basics here. The overreaction is to say right now, oh, Iran will now deal, since we've said for months that it wouldn't. And that's what we've seen in the last week from many outlets. Iran will say that it will talk, but it is not going to deal, because what it wants are two things. What it wants, first of all, is it wants some easing of the sanctions. Two, it wants some acknowledgement that it can enrich to 20% uranium on its soil. The task for the British and the American systems, and I can talk about some questions and answers, but I don't think they are fully unified on this and have fully understood this, at least in terms of the strategy, is how they time the easing of sanctions to some type of Iranian concessions regarding control and inspection of the enrichment program. And then 45 seconds, Mr. Chairman, for the missing dimension, which is Area 3. It's a personal note. Why do I not like the nuclear approach, nuclear first approach? I don't like it for another reason. If you were to talk about the serious threat, at least the serious issue for me since June of 2009, the serious issue is not that of an Iranian nuclear weapon. It is that of a regime's action against its own people. It is a breaking up of civil society, the detaining of hundreds, the disruption of communications, the denial of basic human rights. I'm not arguing that the United States government should go out and advocate a human rights first approach, primarily because it lacks credibility in doing so. But by prioritizing the nuclear issue, we close off the space to even consider and acknowledge that dimension of civil society and human rights, which of course is not just a question within the borders of Iran, but one which goes beyond them as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Very good timing. Okay, so our third speaker is Asaf and Siniver. And before I briefly say a word about Asaf, I just want to publicly thank him and David Dunn for initiating this idea, because it was their suggestion that we went ahead with this workshop. And so, which I think is a great idea, and so thank you to both of them for that, and to Asaf for all the hard work to get in taking it forward in the early stages. Asaf is a senior lecturer in international security here at Birmingham, and specialising in the following areas: the international relations of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the broader Middle East. And he gave a short inaugural today, which was very engaging indeed, on the research he's doing under his Leaving Fellowship. He's very interested in third-party mediation and conflict resolution, and his current research is looking at explaining the success and failure of third-party mediation in the Arab-Israeli conflict. As I say, that's supported by a 2-year Leaving Research Fellowship. And Asaf is going to talk about the question of will Israel attack Iran.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, will Israel attack Iran? My plan was to begin by saying that only 2 people in the world who really know whether Israel will attack Iran, and these people are Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Barak. But having listened to Scott, I would say there are 3 people in the world who now know whether Israel will attack Iran, so I'll add you to that distinguished list. I will try to be less cynical than Scott, and I would argue that there are good and logical explanations or arguments to explain why Israel will attack Iran, and at the same time I would argue there are good explanations to argue why Israel will not attack Iran. I will very briefly go through them and then try to explain against this weapon why do we keep hearing this rhetoric from the Israeli government about the urgency to attack Iran. So why Israel will attack Iran? The first point is that the Israelis, broadly speaking, the Israeli public, does believe that a nuclear Iran is an existential threat to the country. And again, this is not just a government line. A series of public opinion polls in the country suggest that the vast majority of Israelis, depending on which day of the week you survey them, but anything between 70 and 90% believe that a nuclear Iran is an existential threat. Now, the important point here is, and I completely agree with Scott, it's not that they believe that Iran has the capabilities. We know that they are far from the 20% of enriched uranium to reach this target, but the Israelis or the Israeli government does not want Iran to get to that point. It's not about the Iranians using it or having the capability, it's about stopping them from getting there. The second point is that Israel believes that the international community will not stop the Iranians, if push comes to shove, will stop the Iranians from reaching that benchmark. And there are obvious reasons why the West will not want to get involved in another war with a Muslim country. There's no need to elaborate there. So the Israelis believe that the West or the international community will not do our job, we have to do it ourselves. And the third point is that Israeli society is remarkably resilient, thanks to decades of wars, conflicts, suicide bombings, terror attacks, rocket attacks from the Gaza Strip and Lebanon. And the Israelis, it seems that the Israelis are sort of mentally prepared, if you like, to absorb the consequences of an attack on Iran. The defense minister Barak said that There will be anything between 500 and 1,000 casualties. The Israeli economy recovered fairly quickly from the war with Hezbollah in 2006. 1 million Israelis sat in shelters for a period of 34 days, but they supported the military campaign against Hezbollah. So in this respect, the society is remarkably resilient. The fourth point, but that's very important, is the issue of deterrence, or the concept of deterrence in Israeli strategic thinking. Deterrence is one of the cornerstones of Israeli military doctrine. Now, Israel, according to some experts, received a serious blow at the end of, in the aftermath of the 2006 war with Hezbollah, a major blow to its deterrence, and Israel needs to recuperate, if you like, and restore its deterrence. Now, after all this rhetoric that's come out of Israel for the past 18 months, and Israel says we will attack, we can attack, we may attack, and we should attack. If they do not attack at the end, it's a major blow again to Israel's deterrence, and I think that's an important calculation. And the final point about why Israel will attack Iran is that we need to look at the precedents of bombing the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, and then going after the Syrian facility in 2007. Now, obviously, there are very important differences between Iraq and Syria and Iran. The geopolitical reasons, the risks involved, the intelligence available, and so forth. But what these precedents show us is that Israelis are absolutely determined to prevent its neighbors from acquiring nuclear capabilities. We know about Stuxnet, the computer virus which disabled the Iranian systems for a few months. We know about the targeted assassinations of Iranian scientists, which of course Israel denies. We know about the secret air bases which Israel holds in Azerbaijan on Iran's northern border. I really don't believe, I don't even know if Scott knows the full information and intelligence reports, but I believe that in terms of what Israel can do and can achieve if it does decide to go after Iran, I believe that it's like an iceberg. I think it's only about 10% is visible, and the majority is below the surface. We simply do not know what Israelis can do. But if you do know, please tell me. Why will Israel not attack Iran? The first point is the American connection. As you all know, the Israelis are known for the chutzpah, but I think even Netanyahu and Barak, the most outspoken proponents of an attack, at least in terms of the rhetoric coming out of Jerusalem, even they know that you do not bind the hand that feeds you. And the degree of cooperation, forget about the $3 billion a year and all the Americans subsidizing the various Israeli defense systems and so forth. I believe that the Israelis and the Americans know that if Israel was to go after Iran, they cannot do it without the Americans. Both Israel and the Americans know it, for obvious military, strategic, and political reasons. And again, it is supported by public opinion polls, where only a fifth of Israeli citizens, about 22%, advocate an attack on Iran without the Americans. Nearly half of them, about 47%, support an attack, but only if the Americans were on Israel's side. Later this year in October, only a couple of weeks before the presidential elections, for example, Israel and the United States will hold the largest, most elaborate joint defense maneuver called Austere Challenge 12. It will incorporate up to 4,000 soldiers from units across the IDF and American defense establishment. They will test multiple Israeli and American defense systems, including Israel's Arrow system, which was financed and developed jointly by Israel and the Americans. And the Arrow system is designed to intercept Iranian missiles in the stratosphere so it doesn't get to Israel's airspace. Israel simply will not throw all this cooperation, all this support from the Americans to begin. This is the logical, if you like, conclusion that Israel will not go alone, and if we do go, it will be the Americans. Now, according to most intelligence reports and estimates, the Iranian nuclear facilities or capabilities are so buried, more than 100 foot underground, and it would be quite difficult for, again, this is what we know, to American or Israeli bunker busters to reach that deep underground. And even if Israel does manage to destroy a large proportion of Iran's nuclear program, the knowledge is already there. So there's nothing stopping the Iranians from resuming this program, only this time with a vengeance. And finally, that leads me to the final point of why Israel will not attack Iran, is that I think the vast majority of people in the international community believe that a bombed Iran is a far greater threat to Israel and the international community than an Iran with a bomb. That's a very important lesson to take from that. So taking these, if you like, the yes and the no's to the question, how do we square the circle? How do we explain this rhetoric that comes out of the Prime Minister's office the past 2 years? Do the Israelis really believe that they are going after Iran, that they can do it, they should do it, they will do it? The first answer, Scott alluded to it very briefly, is the Palestinian issue. I don't know if you've noticed, but we haven't seen the kind of criticism or pressure on Israel to move forward on the Palestinian track, the kind of pressure that we saw in 2009 and 2010, for example. And that's because Netanyahu has been very successful in bringing the Iranian issue to the top of the international agenda. Everybody's talking about Iran. Let's not get the Palestinians into it. So we keep it on the back burner. And couple it with the fact that Netanyahu's government is by far the most far right-wing nationalistic government in the country's history. It's not a government that is naturally disposed towards showing goodwill gestures and accommodating Palestinian demands. So it suits the interests of this government very well to keep talking about Iran, get everybody else talking about Iran, and forget the Palestinian track. And finally, I will conclude with this point, and that the constant rhetoric from Israel, the way I see it, is designed to put pressure on the international community, to put pressure on Iran. So, 30 seconds.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you to all three of you for staying with time. Okay, so we have 20 minutes. I'm going to run 10 minutes over because I took you to the beginning.